Okay, on to Chapter 6. For Chapter 6, which is the head assembly, we're going to need tray 1 and bag 4. We got bag 4 here. And out of tray 1, we're going to get the head assembly and the main grips. And the radius arm pieces. Okay, here you can see we got everything laid out, all the parts out of bag 4. So we're going to start with what they want as the uniball radius arm assembly. That's this guy here, plastic link here. Alright, they want bearing and this spacer, the longer of the spacers that you have here, and then another bearing on the opposite side. And we'll do the same thing with the other arm. Like so. So the first piece that we assembled was what the manual is calling the uniball radius arm assembly. Now the next part is the radius arm assembly. The first one was plastic, the second piece is aluminum. And on this one, they're wanting us to use Loctite, green Loctite, when inserting the bearings to keep the bearings from coming out of this thing. They kind of just set in there pretty lightly. So I'm going to get some Loctite on there, and also we're going to be using the smaller of our spacers for the aluminum assembly here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do while the Loctite is drying on our radius arm assembly, we're going to pull the head apart, inspect the head, make sure we have all the parts needed inside the head, make sure we got the thrust bearings, make sure we put the thrust bearings in the correct order. So I'm just going to loosely start pulling everything apart here, push the thrust assembly out, the spacer, we're going to do that on both sides. Pull the whole head assembly apart. Check for grease. My O-rings seem pretty dry. A little bit of grease there, not as much as I'd like to see. And our spacers, both blade grips are apart. Just the bearings left in either one. Here we're going to look at the thrust assembly and how they have it installed. Okay, there's our spacer. On all thrust assemblies you want the larger ID of it to the inside or towards the head block. As we can see, this one is very loose. Then we have our caged ball assembly. Then we have the other side of the thrust bearing assembly. You can see this one is very tight on the shaft. A little bit of movement. And this one has a lot of wiggle room to it. So they got that installed correctly. That's good. No Loctite on any of these bolts yet. They left the assembly loose for us to inspect, which is excellent. A lot of companies will have this so Loctited up you can't even get it apart unless you get out the heat. And then half the times you get them apart and they're assembled wrong to begin with. So they make it really difficult on you to find out a problem. In this case, everything just falls right apart. Now we can go through, grease everything up really good, and put the assembly back together. Okay, here you can see we got the head parts all laid out in the order of which things we're going to install. Note, I've installed the uniball onto the end of the blade grips. Make sure and use Loctite. Also, the blade grip arm is separate from the blade grip itself. Okay, this is two pieces. Through the inside of here is our bolt that tightens this piece onto the blade grip itself. Check that, make sure it's Loctited, make sure it's tight. Mine were very tight, very well Loctited, so just double check it. So those are ready to go also. So we have our head block, we have our dampers, we have a spacer that goes on the end of the dampers. Our spindle is going to run through the head block. Then we're going to slide our blade grips onto the spindle, followed by our neck spacer, our thrust assembly, and finally the bolt. Loctite on this bolt for sure, and you're going to need two 4mm wrenches to tighten the assembly together. So I'll get everything all greased up, and then we'll come back and review. Something else I should touch base on, the manual specifically talks about it. You want to use a synthetic grease on these O-rings, these dampeners. You don't want to use a petroleum-based grease on these. It will deteriorate the dampener, it'll get hard, it'll get brittle, and it'll lead to just problems down the end of the road. Also, when you're sliding the spindle through the head block, through the dampeners, which are at this point full of grease, you want to make sure and you clean up all the threads, all the grease out of the threads on both ends. I just took a paper towel with some alcohol soaked, pushed it down inside here, spun it around 2-3 times, cleaned it out on both sides. You do not want the bolts to come out of the spindle. I have had this happen on a 600 helicopter, and it wasn't pretty. So just make sure and clean that out before you bolt everything together. Okay, so there we have it. Everything assembled. We got our head block, the spindle, our dampeners, the blade grips, the thrust assembly. Everything's assembled and together. One thing to note, everything went very smooth. However, I did do it twice because I was concerned about something. On this blade grip, everything turns nice and smooth. On this blade grip, it's actually quite notchy. Wasn't happy with that. So I took it apart, see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. I didn't. The only thing I can think of is when the guys at the factory installed the blade grip bearings into the blade grip with their retaining compound. Some of that retaining compound got into the bearing, therefore making it notchy. I'm going to put about 2-3 flights on this thing. I'll pop the links off, rotate the assembly, see if it's smoothed out, see if that compound got worked out of there, that retaining compound, that Loctite. If not, then I'll be pulling the blade grips off, pulling the bearings out of this, and changing the bearings. Okay, now we're going to be working on our linkage rod assembly. On these links here, there is marked an L and an R on each side. Okay, these are like true turnbuckles. There's a hole through the center of this thing, and when you turn it, the whole assembly will tighten together, and when you turn it the other way, the whole assembly will move apart. Okay, unlike the other ball links or linkages that we get are the same hand threads. If you just turn from the center, it's tightening one side and loosening the other, whereas this will tighten everything together and loosen together for really fine adjustments on our head. So we'll get those together and we'll come back. Okay, I got the linkage rod assemblies done. I was able to thread on the ball links onto the rods all the way in until you couldn't see any more threads, and I backed each side out one full turn, which gave me exactly 62 millimeters, which the manual is speccing for a length on this rod. I was quite surprised with that. I've never actually had one come out exactly on the recommended length. So we're going to snap these on to our blade grips, and I am making sure that on these linkage rods there's an R and an L. I'm going to put the R to the top on both of them, just so they're the same if I have to make any adjustments. And those snap on very tight, but yet they're very free. On my 630 build, when I snapped on my linkages, they were pretty stiff and they need a little bit of sizing. These are very smooth, but there's no slop whatsoever. I like that a lot. Okay, now on to the radius arm assemblies. Special note, make sure to measure these bolts. This is a 15 millimeter. This one is 18 millimeter. Very similar if they're just laying side by side. Measure those. Make sure you have the right ones. The 15 millimeter is being spec'd to go through the bearings of the uniball radius arm, and that bolt will bolt to the radius arm itself. Okay? On this guy here, if you note, this edge is much straighter line than this edge. This makes a nice kink in it. The bolt is going to go through from the straighter side, through the bearings, through the spacer inside there. It's going to then attach to our radius arm assembly with the SAB logo facing out in this orientation. I'm going to put some Loctite on that, come back and review. Okay, we got both the radius arm assemblies together. That's very nice. With the crush tubes inside here, you can tighten that down really tight. There is a slight raised edge here, so no need for a washer between the bearing and this radius arm assembly. There's a raised portion in there that rides on the inner race of the bearing. However, when we bolt this assembly to the head block, it's going to go in this orientation into the lower hole of the head block. We'll be using that 18 millimeter bolt like I talked about and a washer. So when this assembly is tightened down, that washer is going to ride against the inner race of this bearing, and that crush tube will do its work as well, so that'll be able to be very tight without any binding. Okay, so that concludes Chapter 6, the head assembly. Just to review for a moment, touching back on the bearings inside the blade grips, like I said before, I ended up with one side that was pretty notchy in comparison to the other side. The other side is really smooth. Hopefully that'll break in after a couple of flights. That retaining compound, that Loctite that they use to hold the bearings in the grips will smooth out. Otherwise, everything else on the head was straightforward. It fell right into place. The linkage grips are very smooth, very free. Our linkage rod assembly, our radius arm assemblies are attached. Pay attention to the bolt size. Like I said, I apologize again. I gave you the wrong information initially, but I did come back and give you the right information, so hopefully that doesn't make you have to do the step twice. So, in conclusion, make sure pay attention to the instructions as always, and we'll be back with Chapter 7, which is going to be the tail rotor assembly.